Good afternoon again, everybody. I feel like I've been here for a lot of today. You've been seeing the lady in green. But we have a really exciting session this afternoon, which really is going to focus on organisations really saying and doing what they say. And we know from the sessions we've had this morning that a lot of people have really glitzy websites, say a lot of what they're doing, but when you get underneath the covers and in the organisation, that's not necessarily always the case. We've got an amazing panel here this afternoon, very interactive, and actually we're probably going to play it around a little bit and make it very interactive to get the best out of the sessions for you and definitely for them. So I'll start by getting them to all introduce themselves. Most of you know who I am because you saw me this morning at least twice on a panel. But I am Dr. Heather Melville. I'm actually the outgoing chair of CMI Women. I've had a 40-odd year career across various industries. Predominantly, most of it's been banking. I've seen a lot of what we've talked about here throughout the whole day, throughout my career. I've got a portfolio career now where I'm a non-exec director for Teneo. I run my own business. I'm also the Chancellor of York University. I've done lots of firsts in my life. And actually, the reason for doing lots of firsts, somebody's given me an opportunity to be the real person that I am. I've worked in an organisation where the culture has allowed me to be who I am as well. And by the way, it hasn't always been easy, and that's what we want to get out of today. But I think when we were talking earlier on in the earlier sessions, we were talking about values and purpose and vision and culture and all of those things, which actually, if you're in an organisation where those things aren't truly there, you will never be the best that you can be. So the session that we want to discuss this afternoon is when people can be the true essence of who they are because of where they work and the work that they're really pushing and driving their industry or their organisation to do. So as I said, we're joined by three amazing women. Two of them I know really well, so I need to hold myself back because I want them to tell you who they are. And the other lady, I sat on a panel some years ago, so I haven't seen her for quite a while. So that's really good. So I think we'll start with you at the end, Lorna. If you just want to do a brief intro, who you are, what you're doing, why today is important to you.
Thanks, Heather. Hello all, and it's such a pleasure to be here on this panel and part of CMI. I'm Executive Director at Nomura, which is a Japanese investment bank, and I've been in financial services now for the best part of several decades. And what I've seen over the decades is that there's been a lot of talk about diversity. There's been very disparate from a gender perspective from when I started 30 years ago to now. And I don't see that a lot has actually really changed. I find that dependent on the organization that you work for, and all the organizations I've worked for is from American banks to British banks to European banks to Dutch banks and now a Japanese bank. And they all have their different cultures, but they're all still saying the same thing, which is quite bizarre. So for me today, it's really important just to understand in terms of, okay, let's stop talking, because we seem to do a lot of that in the industry. How do we actually change the diversity angle, in particular within financial services?
Thank you.
Terrific. So I'll go next. I'm Sundiatu Dixon-Fyle. I'm very excited to be here. I work for a management consultancy, McKinsey, and there I do research and also sort of organizational and cultural change around diversity and inclusion, supporting our firm and our clients on a topic that I'm hugely passionate about. I have a healthcare background, but pivoted to doing this a couple of years ago. And since then, it's been a really rewarding journey. We do research on the business case for diversity and inclusion, some of which is quoted in your handouts. And we do this across the firm. We do that to understand how diversity helps companies, how it helps communities, how it helps our wider society, and always try and bring a bit of a sort of factual and analytical dimension to what is clearly, an extremely important human topic as well. So I'm very excited by the whole premise of today. I think we're at a turning point, I think, in the diversity and inclusion journey, where indeed there's been a lot of progress, but at the same time, not that much progress. And we're facing significant changes in the wider economy, changes linked to the pandemic, things linked to changes in the way our companies, our workplaces look like. And I think it's a real opportunity to sort of step back and sort of think, well, what have we learned in the sort of past decade or 15 years of working on diversity and inclusion? What genuinely has led to the change that we have seen? And what are the remaining obstacles that we need to overcome, recognizing that this stuff is hard, but there's a way out. And I think that's what's really exciting about today, which is to discuss what are the ways in which you could really drive change.
Thank you. And then over to you, Anna.
So I have been lucky enough to actually sit with Heather on the CMI Women Board. So I'm part of that board. I think it's been 2 years now that I've been involved. I'm a strategy consultant. I work for myself. I'm a business founder. I'm the MD of Human, which is an early stage startup in the EDI space. I'll talk about this. I do fit into a number of marginalised groups, one of which you can probably observe in that I am a female. I'm also otherwise neurodiverse, so I have ADHD and autism. I'm a single parent, I'm a carer, and both my children are also disabled. And I'm the first in my family to go to university. So I suppose I say that only in that we all fit into lots of different groups. And diversity is not just about those that we can see and that groups are marginalised, but there are often things that people feel excluded because of things that they are that aren't necessarily part of being a marginalised group. So I work for myself and I'm happy to do so. And I'm hopefully here to share some insight into what I do.
Okay, so let me share just a little bit about the Everyone report, the economy report, if somebody wasn't here before I get into the session with my colleagues here. So the Everyone economy report found that there is a growing body of evidence which demonstrates that greater diversity and inclusion leads to better organisational performance. It's quite interesting because your company was behind a lot of the work, the original work around the research, how many years ago? And in today's world, we are still talking about the business case for diversity. I don't know of any other topic, any other business subject that can still, in today's world, command that we need to go away and find a business case for doing something about this, right? So let's just hold that thought there. However, CMI's research has uncovered a significant say-do gap. Employers think and say they're doing the right thing, but they're failing to deliver appropriate action to create more inclusive workplaces for women and other groups. This shortfall means that many people continue to encounter discrimination and exclusion. And just to add, in the session this morning, exclusion is not just about your race, your gender, the things that you can see. Sometimes it could be just as simple that you haven't been in an organisation or an industry as long as somebody else has or your colleagues have been. And by way of that, sometimes they can quite easily exclude somebody who's not part of that group. And it's interesting, I've watched that happen in a couple of organisations and people lose their voices. They start to shrink. And then they start to not perform in the way that they would normally perform. Then they get disgruntled or they get ill and they leave. So there is a wider piece around creating an inclusive environment than a nice to have. It's all around business performance. So Lorna, my first question really goes to you. And it's really, how can organisations close the say-do gap and deliver an inclusive workplace?
I'm going to come back to your inclusion point because that's really important. And I do think there are 2 or 3 key things. And the first one, I think, is really around authenticity. And this is authenticity within the leadership team. So if you really want to start changing the culture and changing the mindset and the thinking, you have to do it with intent from a leadership perspective. If you're just trying to do it as in terms of a tick box exercise, yes, you will attract the talent, but how long will they stay around? Okay. And we all like data, and we all like to say, okay, we need to hit our targets. And I do agree there is a balance to setting targets, because you all have to start somewhere. But if it's not authentic, then it's not going to be sustainable within the organization. And the other thing also, and you touched on it already, Heather, is around inclusion. And there's so many times that I've heard people in my organization saying, but we're diverse. So is that not the same as, we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, but we're diverse. We've got 80 different nationalities within the firm. Okay, from a race perspective, when we look at gender, yes, we're not on par with our male counterparts, but, we're not that far behind. So when we talk about understanding really what diversity and inclusion is, it's not because you've got 80 different nationalities in the firm. It's not because you've got 50% of women, or, you've got 50% of people with disabilities within the firm. For me, it's about really understanding what is inclusion. And inclusion, as you rightly pointed out, is when somebody's been excluded. And the biggest thing, and I'm sure you're all aware of, microaggressions. And that really then starts to rear its head. And Heather, you talked about, just because, you have the diversity around the table doesn't necessarily mean that they are diverse. So is it, when you go into the workplace, how do people feel included? How do they bring their whole selves to work? And, just having them, in the meeting room, because they don't, their accent is not a British accent and people doesn't necessarily understand them, they may get excluded from stretch opportunities. Because they're the quietest one in the room, you may not take them to meetings. So, there is a lot of microaggressions that people are probably not aware of, which makes people feel excluded. So I do think you need to be careful when people look at diversity and try to mar it with inclusivity within the organization, because they're very, very different.
Thank you. It's really, as you were talking, I was thinking that whole thing about microaggressions is a really powerful way of really making somebody feel excluded. And it's like that question, did you really go to that university? So asking the question, did you go to university, that's not a problem. What do you think is the problem? Anyone in the audience? The really. It's the really, did you really go to that university? Do you really live in that area? All of those things that sometimes we need to educate leaders in their language. And equally, if we were all to pick up ourselves and go to, say, India or somewhere else, we would be the minority. So the culture that they would have in those countries would be very different to how the culture where we used to be here. And that means, how do we become included in that culture? The things that they do, understanding the different faiths and the time that people take out to go and pray and do, so it's an understanding. And I always find it's a time of education. And we heard that this morning, right? So inclusion for me is around building an educational community of people who want to learn more about people, who actually love people, right? Because you can have the most awesome buildings with the most awesome technology, but if you haven't got great people who feel empowered and a sense of belonging to actually make a difference, then actually they're never going to strive. And my final point on that, before I go to you, Anna, is how many of you watch breakfast TV in the morning? Admit to watching breakfast TV then. Okay. So I watch it, and I'm always really intrigued with the team spirit across that whole group of people. And I often say to myself, there's a bit of banter between them, then when there's serious things they're talking about, they come together. They all look very different, all different backgrounds, but together they look quite united. And I often say to myself, especially when there is a topic that's quite a challenging topic, how do they all bring the authenticity of who they are so that they still come across as one team with a sense of belonging, that really have the same purpose, but they've got their own personalities? And that's really what we should feel when we work in an organisation. We all come in and we've got a different size, we wear different clothes, we're different heights, all of that, but we should still feel a sense of, actually, guess what? I'm really proud to work here. So my next question for you, Anna, is how can leaders embed diversity inclusion in their organisation's culture and hold themselves accountable for progress? That's a long one.
Yeah, it is a long one, but I wanted to go back to what you've just said, actually. And I think that the only way that we can really start to talk about inclusion, if we notice exclusion and talk about exclusion and have conversations that are difficult, ask the questions. So many organisations historically, I believe, have tended to brush things under the carpet and say that doesn't happen here. But actually, somebody said earlier on one of the panels, you shine the light in the dark corners and you see what's making people feel excluded. Have those conversations. Don't be shy as a leader to ask questions, to understand, to learn. And that creates empathy through, sharing your own lived experience of exclusion. You can teach other people, and vice versa. As a leader, you need to ask where people feel excluded, why they're not fitting in, why are they struggling. You might get answers that you don't want to hear, but it's so important to ask those questions.
Just on that point, which I think is a really important point, typically the person who feels excluded and says they feel excluded will be the perpetrator, will be the person that feels that there's something wrong with them.
Yeah.
And actually, that's not a great leader, because the leader should be able to identify that there are some challenges across the business, but they should, with the people within that business, but they should also ask the person in a really elegant way, what do you think it is that we could do to make you feel more part of the team? Or what is it that we're not doing that's making you feel excluded? Very different form of questioning that doesn't perpetrate the feeling of being excluded on the person who already feels quite out of it and doesn't want to feel more of that.
Yeah, so in terms of embedding inclusion into an organisation, I do think listening is a skill that is massively underrated. Leaders do a lot of talking quite often, certainly in very traditional organisations. The leaders at the front, they're, telling everybody this is the way it's going to be. But actually great leaders tend to listen more than they talk, or at least as much as they talk. So listening is a key point, really. I think that, like you've also said, organisations can be diverse without being inclusive, and we've seen a lot of that in the tick box stuff. Again, that's what needs to change, and the only way that you can change and become more inclusive is by becoming more empathetic, which is what CMI really does help leaders to, I think, question, to understand, and to become more empathic. Not everybody has that empathy bone like I do, that is, I'm right out there and telling everybody I love them, but not everybody can do that. But you have to be able to listen, and listening is a skill and it creates empathy. So that would be one of my big things. I think building, obviously you've touched on it there, Lorna, as well, into recruitment process. Future talent is a huge thing. Our recruitment practices need to change. We need to make sure that we have diverse pools to choose from, because our future generations that are coming through, identifying future leaders, we've said earlier, we're choosing businesses now based on values. So that's key as well, I think, changing recruitment practices. And I know that's something that you're quite hot on there, Heather. I could go on, but
keep going, because this is quite important.
Okay. So what have I got here? Transparency, openness, empathy, listen, share, and lead by example. So I think leaders who hide away in boardrooms, I think actually leaders diarising time to get out. And we used to talk about it, didn't we? Get out on the floor and walk the walk and talk the talk. Speak to people, not where you're expected to be. So go down to reception, go and speak to your security guards, see what's happening on the shop floor, if you like, not just in manufacturing in those terms, but across your organisations. Make sure you're doing that, shining the light in those dingy dark corners and asking questions. Paying lip service, we've touched on that. Not paying lip service, but not just ticking the box, but actually doing.
When you say paying lip service, what do you mean?
I think so many organisations now have a D&I strategy or a D&I plan, and that's enough for them. They've got the plan. We've talked quite a lot. You'll have probably heard this morning about making sure the measures are there, that we are quantifying what it is that we are looking at. If you don't measure, you don't know, do you? So we've all been asked to fill in diversity forms when we join an organisation, tick the box, but they only focus on some very specific areas. You're not going to understand the extent of how a person might feel excluded unless you have those conversations, ask the questions, and be open to recording the answers and doing something about it. So I suppose taking personal responsibility is key, and it's not just leaders. We've talked about middle managers, making sure that your teams are listened to, understood, and that you're feeding that back in, to senior management, because I'm a believer in that it starts from the top, but the top also has to link to the bottom somehow.
Thank you. That takes me to Sundiatu. And this question is quite a big one, given the work that your organisation has done and the role that you play, because you're one of the D&I leaders who is really trying to transform not just how the employees feel, but the leaders in the organisation, and the wider impact of that is in how they react with their clients, because it's a very big part of everything that you do and you stand for, given all the reports you've done. So I think, how do we change the narrative and place the focus on the enormous benefits that greater equity offers?
Yes, well, I think that, as we've heard, it's a vital question. It's not easy to achieve real progress on diversity, equity, inclusion, culture change, belonging. For many people, these are all sort of new words that, even 10 years ago, if you ask someone to define belonging, they may not necessarily have come up with a definition, or may not necessarily have been able to say, well, why this matters to an organization. So this stuff is hard. And actually, as I said earlier, I feel that we are at a bit of a turning point. We're at a turning point following a journey which over the past sort of 5, 10, 15 years has led us to work towards gender equality and equity. There's been Me Too, there's been Black Lives Matter, there's been much more awareness of the need for racial and ethnic inclusion, and there's been a real need to broaden the conversation around diversity and inclusion and to widen this to other forms of diversity as well, be they physical, disability, neurodiversity, social mobility. And things have progressed. The representation of women, our research shows that representation of women in leadership has increased significantly. We have probably in our data set of companies that we follow across the world, about 10% who are now approaching parity in their executive teams in terms of gender. But at the same time, we're not seeing that progress is matched when it comes to ethnic diversity, and other forms of diversity aren't even tracked in a systematic way. So there's been some progress. But I think the reason we're at a turning point is a couple of things. So one is, obviously, the world is in shock, reeling from the pandemic and from the socioeconomic challenges that companies are facing. And this is leading some companies to rethink their investments and the efforts they're placing in support of DEI. And that means...
Just interrupt you there. In a positive way, do you think?
It's a mixture.
Right. Okay.
So I think when we last did research on this, we had companies where their D&I strategy was not affected by the economic context. But then you did have some that were scaling back, but some were doubling down. So it was really dependent on the company culture, on the leadership.
Right.
But that said, there clearly was a tendency to think, well, oh my gosh, we've got to cut costs, and so we'll scale back. And so I think that is one of the headwinds that DEI is facing. There's also the realization that this stuff is hard, and people sometimes feel, because there's just so much to address, right? So you've been working on representation, so you've got your recruiting and you're trying to get the numbers, but then you realize you've also, as we've all been saying, have got to work on changing your organizational culture and on promoting inclusive leadership, creating a culture of transparency, of acceptance, of promoting belonging, and these are all new things which you're not used to doing, and so you feel that it's hard. And then on top, there's, resistance in some parts of organizations. Let's be clear that the resistance is not necessarily, it's not necessarily out of principle. It's often that middle managers, for example, are just extremely busy, and they've got multiple priorities that they've got to attend to, and sometimes this is not at the top of their priority list. And so there's just a combination of headwinds, which I think are what makes it really important for us to sort of step back and think about that.
There, because this is a bugbear for me, particularly about middle managers. So do you think they need to get more training on how to become an inclusive leader? That's one thing. And the second thing is, do you think that if it isn't part of their objectives about helping to create an inclusive organization, and I'm choosing those words very carefully because that is a skill within itself. We're assuming that the people at the top actually know what it is to be an inclusive leader, and therefore should be role modeling that to the people as line managers that work for them. Now, when you were talking a bit, I was saying to myself, you mentioned that they were too busy. I hear that a lot. We heard that in the session this morning where there was a new CEO who was too busy to take on the role of making sure there's a more inclusive organization. Actually, can you imagine going to the chief exec of your business if you had to put a strategy plan, a business case around business development, and you said to them, I'm too busy to put together a plan that's going to deliver that? Do you think you'd have a job? So I feel once again, and this is where, as a management company, you can help drive that change, that it's wider than just the poor middle managers who sometimes they're people that have come out of a sales environment or a different environment, and they've been given this really powerful asset of the organization, right? Valuable asset to manage without a slight of management skills.
Yes.
Without understanding what a good leader could be like, but also what a bad leader could be like. And before you answer, I just want to share this because this is something that happened quite recently. A young lady that I coach had a new boss, and she's new in her role as well. So she's done really well. She's Afro-Caribbean. And her boss said to her, now listen to what I'm going to say. Her boss said to her, how can I tell someone who's ethnically diverse that they're not performing? Okay. So when she said that to me, I said, just ignore that comment. It's not meant at you personally. In his mind, what he's trying to say is not you, but how do I tell someone that looks different to me that they could be underperforming? So what do you think happened? That individual absorbed that, thinking, one, it was her. Two, she's thinking because she's ethnically diverse, she's going to get a different message to somebody who isn't ethnically diverse around their performance, when actually what we are talking about is predominantly performance.
It's individual.
Absolutely. But the point I go back to is the line manager, the language that they use, if they haven't been taught of the impact that language can have a really devastating impact on someone in their career.
Yes, I mean, Heather, we call this inclusive leadership, and I think you really hit the nail on the head in terms of why it's so important to change that narrative. It starts at the top, and it starts with making sure that inclusion is as important a priority as anything else, and that will require the head of the organization, the executive team, to make that explicit and to remind the entire organization perpetually through multiple fora that this is as important as anything else. And then it also comes from, as you said, role modeling, but ultimately people need to also have the skills. And it comes from leadership development, capability building around inclusive leadership. And inclusive leadership means a lot of things. It means indeed, first of all, being aware of the reason why inclusion matters and why it is of value to organizations, be it from a business perspective, but also from a human and organizational perspective. So being conversant around why it matters, being conversant around what are the issues that employees face, what is the lived experience of employees that may be in a minority or in a majority, and being able to talk about that and connect around that. Being cognizant around biases and where they are in the organization, particularly around career progression. How transparent are our promotion criteria? How equal is our process for promoting people? So being deep into that without necessarily being an HR expert, but at least being able to understanding data, and, you know, and being able to dig beneath the surface, understand root causes. If you're seeing different attrition rates, if you're seeing differences in promotion rates, time to promotion, what is causing that? And I think really building the skills to be able to talk in an inclusive way and lead teams in an inclusive way.
And that's the key
is a skill which not everyone necessarily has, but it is a skill which can be taught.
Lorna, you report to the COO, who holds ultimate responsibility for DE&I. Why do you think he's got that role?
He's got that role, I believe, because he understands D&I. He is just below the CEO, so he has the professionalism, he has the leadership to be able to drive that. So that's why I believe that he has the role, so he can actually take ownership of it to be able to drive it. However, that being said, is enough being done? And I just wanted to go back to the points that you were talking about, Sundiatu, regarding, and you mentioned it about senior leaders being too busy to be able to prioritize D&I. And I was talking to a lovely lady today who sat on the board of the FCA, which is the Financial Conduct Authority. And between the FCA and PRA, they're delivering a white paper regarding D&I and getting financial institutions to be held accountable for it. So she was asking me the question, and as everybody knows, banks are held to so much regulation. They're tied up in so much regulation around any market abuse, products they're bringing to the market, and capital around the world. So if you breach any of those, you're going to be heavily fined, right? And obviously, there's a reputational damage that goes with it. So the question she asked me was, are we being too strict by holding banks accountable to report on their DE&I strategies? Because again, they're complaining that they're tied up in so much regulation. So it goes back to the question of what you said, Heather, you know, when you want to bring a product to market, when you've got a sales initiative, you bring a business case. And they'll sit down and think, oh, yes, it will make us very profitable. So yes, let's go ahead, let's go and do it. And suddenly they find the budget to be able to do it and the investment to be able to do it. So Sundiatu, you mentioned about, you know, we're now in a world, the economy is shrinking. So the first thing that goes within firms is the D&I budget, okay? If they're being held...
That makes sense, because they've all said how important it really is.
So it is about not just talking the talk, it's about walking the walk. So for me, it's always about put your money where your mouth is, essentially. And I do feel that if they are held accountable, and the real way to, I think, especially within financial services where there have been, you know, their bonus packages, their compensation packages are absolutely huge. If it's within their objectives to do it, they will invest time in it. They will invest money in it. And then you can become best practice and a nice to have, and it's a part of everybody's DNA, essentially. But you have to start somewhere, and it does bridge on it being a tick box exercise, but you have to start somewhere to be able to make it no longer a nice to have. So going back to the answering the question of the CEO, that is why he has been not targeted is probably not the word, but he's got the responsibility of driving the D&I initiative.
And without going too much into the organisation, but is he accountable for that back to the board and the chief exec, or is there some other way he feeds that back?
So he is accountable. There is an element of accountability. There are targets, but they're not necessarily, if you miss targets, then it's not like it's going to impact the profitability of the firm. The perception of that it doesn't impact the profitability of the firm. And I say perception because not having proper diverse employees within the organization longer term will impact the profitability of the firm, essentially. But they're not as good at it. A lot of firms are not as good at it. I think firms just need to get better at being able to report and more comfortable at being able to report.
But I think we should give credit where companies are doing something.
Absolutely.
And where the role of inclusion isn't just down to the person heading up inclusion in the business and talent, but it becomes responsibility of everybody in the organisation from a leadership perspective. I'm going to come back to you, Sundiatu, because I'm thinking for someone like McKinsey's, who charges extortionate amounts of money.
No comment.
I'm just going to say that just to lighten things up a little bit. But on a serious note, for you guys to invest in the whole D&I agenda with your clients and internally, there must be some support from the board, which shows how important this really is.
Yeah, there's phenomenal support. I mean, all of our leaders, our senior partners and partners across the firm, and a lot of them will do it not just because it's the right thing to do, but because personally they actually believe it and are as passionate about it as anyone else, and will have stories about their own personal experiences, be they again being first generation and ending up as chief executive globally of McKinsey, to having spouses, female spouses who have been subjected to lack of equality of opportunity. And so it really illustrates that when you do have that commitment at the top, that is an extremely important ingredient to actually driving change on the ground.
Thank you. I've got one question for each of you to just answer. It's the same question, and just a 1 minute answer. Then I'm going to go out to the audience because there's no such thing as a free lunch. Hope you've all been listening and ready to go. So, how can employees be empowered to drive change within their organisation? I'm going to start with you, Anna. And I know it's quite easy for you because you run your own business, but think about the business that you sell to.
Obviously, very small business I work in, but I think that, again, it's about using your voice, using your position, using your experience to be able to share with other people what you've been through, whether you've felt excluded, whether you've not, and being brave about having conversations that, aren't comfortable quite a lot of the time. So, yeah. Put your money where your mouth is, really. And, having felt different, having felt excluded. And I think is there anybody in this audience that has never felt excluded in any way, shape or form? Who has felt excluded for anything? Oh, look, everybody. And I think that we all have to take that into account. So if you had a conversation with that person next to you and you asked them, where have you felt excluded? Each one of us may have a very different experience, and it might not be what you expect. So that might be something to think about when you're speaking to people later.
Thank you.
I think organizations need to create formal and informal ways to listen and allow people to open up and share their experiences. And you cannot underestimate the number of ways in which it should be possible for people to do that. And so that includes being able to, for example, in a team meeting, at the end of a team meeting, just draw your team manager aside to say, well, actually, I didn't feel, this happened, and, could you support me in the future, through to having sort of town halls where people can share their experiences with senior leaders and give them sort of feedback, and almost sort of in a reverse mentoring situation, through to pulse surveys, which are weekly surveys which people can do. Organizations just send those out on a weekly or bi-weekly basis, and people can literally it takes 30 seconds to just sort of say, well, how are you feeling? And is there anything specific you can share? Through to ombuds, through to expressing yourself through affinity groups and using those as a way to gather views of an entire community and then feed back those views into the management of an organization. There are so many different ways that need to be, and all of them in some ways need to be deployed. There isn't just one single way. The combination of formal and informal is extremely important.
Thank you. And Lorna?
I'm going to echo what the two have just said. I mean, they've said it all so succinctly. And, I would, if whether you want to join one of your networks or shared lived experiences. I do just think it's really important what I touched on earlier regarding the microaggressions and conscious or unconscious biases. And I do think that we all owe a duty of care to ourselves and our colleagues just to think about our language that we use, and not just our verbal language, but also our physical language. I've been in meetings sometimes, been the only female in the room sort of thing, and somebody has literally turned their chair and turned their back to me and talking to the rest of their male colleagues within the organisation, within the meeting. So we all have them.
So how have you addressed that? What have you done when that's happened to you?
Oh, I actually got up and just sat round at another table.
I love that. So if they're going to turn their back to you one way, just go meet them the other way.
Yeah.
I love
and this
it.
is where, if you're not going to give me a seat at the table, I'll bring my own chair. But yeah, just recognize your own biases that you have, because we all have them. We all sometimes don't mean to have them. And be brave and talk to people, ask people about how they're feeling, and make sure that they're included within conversations and within meetings and within the workplace.
Thank you. Right, I've got a question for the audience now. Put the password in. I've got my glasses today. Thank you. So the question for the audience is, how can we finally close the gap between an organisation's stated values and their action to deliver the inclusion? And what will it take to deliver? What will it take to change the game? Now, this is about the wonderful vision statements or websites that organisations have based on the reality of what it feels like to work there. Who wants to be brave? Thank you, that lady over there. And Chatham House rules, by the way, we will not tweet the name or the organisation that's actually bringing this up.
Thank you. Very interesting to hear from all of you speakers. I'm an organisational expert. I work for myself, author, speaker and podcaster, and I focus on how to create workplaces where everyone can flourish. And I look particularly at time intelligence and how we can create workplaces that enable people to make the most of their working time. And I was very struck by a couple of the comments you made about the need for leaders to design time to get out and about, and senior leaders saying they're too busy to prioritise D&I. And I think the single biggest thing that organisations can do to really shift the dial from talking about this into meaningful action and results is twofold, that also relates to two comments you made or I heard. One being how in tough times D&I budgets get cut. And secondly, it was a comment you made, Lorna, about your COO. This isn't, with greatest respect, not personal to your organisation, but I thought it was very interesting that when D&I targets get missed, the comment was from senior leaders, this doesn't impact the profitability of the firm. And those two things say to me that there's a lot of acknowledging and verbally agreeing that D&I is important, and indeed McKinsey's own research proves the link between more diverse leadership teams and organisations and improved profitability, innovation and business performance. Yet when push comes to shove in difficult times, it's the budgets that get cut, it's the events that get reduced in number, it's the D&I support to people from different backgrounds that gets reduced. And yet still D&I targets aren't seen as really related to the profitability of the organisation over the long term. So I think this says to me, it's too much emphasis on the short term, on the financial results, and not on the long term and what D&I really brings to the business performance and profitability over the long term. Sorry, long comment, but I hope you get the gist of it.
Thank you. I wonder if we have a leader in the business, in the audience today, who might want to comment on that without being it personal to them, but just an observation would be really great to hear. And whilst we find someone who's brave enough to see if we can take another question. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. One of the tools that I've used is I make it part of my leadership team's incentivization plan, right? It is part of their KPIs, their targets to deliver around our purpose-driven D&I mission. And as a result of that, and it's what I saw before and after, one of the KPIs we're measuring was churn, right? We were experiencing high churn. Well, by making it part of how they're incentivized, it reduced the churn by 80%.
Wow.
So it's funny how when you drive compensation into it,
Yeah.
it just changes that behavior. But also that signals for me as the CEO of the company, this matters to me and that's important. And I think what we don't see enough is tying it into leaders' compensation plans.
I can
Great,
comment
thank
on
you.
that. You know, I mean, I think that's just an extremely important point where we're seeing more and more organizations that are trying to do just that, which is try to make the aspirations or targets around D&I have a little bit more bite. And they are generally seeing that it's positive. There's generally a lot of resistance to that, but where it can be done in a way which doesn't encourage, for example, gaming or doesn't create antagonism, it can be extremely effective. The other thing I would say is that often D&I leaders in organizations or D&I champions are very committed and spend quite a lot of their own sometimes free time investing in supporting D&I within their organizations. And sometimes it can actually impact their careers in a negative way. So organizations need to be very sensitive to that and think about how they can support leaders, how they can create more of an ally base, and how they can not just celebrate the success of these leaders, but reward them. Promote someone who's been doing something to support diversity and inclusion, not just sort of say that they've been doing a great job. So I think that's also part of the incentivization.
Don't you think actually it's about each of us individually taking responsibility as well as taking responsibility and putting it on the business? If each of us took personal responsibility for making a change, however small it is, rather than just assuming that the business is going to do it for us and train us how to do it, we obviously have to support individuals in creating that change and making things happen.
So is that lady okay?
Sure.
We recently were asked by a client, actually, that we were bidding some work for, that they wanted to know what our own inclusion strategy was, because they did not want to work with an organisation who did not have a strong D&I process in place. And we had to demonstrate how long it had been in place and the changes that we had seen as a result of that. So the reason I kind of asked about leaders out in the audience is this is not something that's going to go away. The people that do business with you now are getting really savvy about that. When you do that, I'm sure you see this in McKinsey, when you get the RFIs and RFPs, the questions that are being asked in there are very specific and targeted around, tell us about your D&I program. Tell us whether you have certain ERG networks that you've set up. Tell us how many women you have promoted within the last X amount of months. Share with us about your pay gap. This is all before they decide to do business with you. So if there's any doubt in anyone's mind that this isn't a business imperative, I think that should make it pretty clear. I've got time for two more questions, very quick questions. One there, and I'd like to take one on, and that gentleman there. Thank you.
Hello, so Hilary Clifford from Starfish Search. We work with a number of organisations in search and often with not-for-profits. And what you'll often see is there's a really clear intention for diversity and for being very open and brave about recruitment at a senior level. But then as trustees or as non-execs who are not paid, and potentially if there are some issues within the organisation, a very safe decision will be made. So the process is quite diverse. There's a nice broad funnel, and then you're all nodding. You can see what then happens in terms of ultimately it's somebody who's got a CV that says they've been to all the right places, so that gives confidence. They've got the background, and ultimately it's that they would say it's risk mitigation, risk management, and that's quite difficult, particularly if you're dealing with trustees who are managing risk and they're unremunerated.
Thank you. Do you want to take that one?
Me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that just shows in some ways that there's still quite a bit of ways to go in terms of changing those mindsets at board level. And some of the research that we have been doing has now kind of gone into the sphere of boards, and we're able to also make the business case at board levels, even though boards are sort of one step removed. So I think there it's again about sort of education and sort of mindset change, because honestly, who knows what the risks are between two individuals who make it at the end of a pretty rigorous recruitment process. So I think there's a lot of mindset change that needs to happen there again.
Thank you. Very quick question from you, this gentleman. Then
Niam Manansala, Public Affairs Officer at CMI. So one of the effects of the say-do gap is pay gap disparities. I'm wondering what you folks think of the importance of gender pay gap reporting and ethnic pay gap reporting to reducing that disparity.
It might be you again, just because of the work that you've been doing.
Sure. So I think that the transparency efforts have been a huge effort and have raised the profile of the need for transparency and for need for gaps to close. It's something which is now on the radar screen of employees that they bring up in their decision making regarding during the recruiting process. Potential recruits will look at that. And I think that there's still quite a bit of ways to go, particularly when it comes to ethnicity pay gap reporting. I think it is a driver of progress. It's a blunt instrument, the way it's done, but I would consider it overall a positive, a step in the right direction.
Thank you. So all that's left for me is to say thank you very much, our very distinguished panel, Lorna, Sundiatu, and to Anna. Thank you so much for being really open and honest and sharing your knowledge, but also sharing best practice. And a huge thank you to the audience for your participation as well. So thank you once again.